and smashing windows, and for a non-violent march. This is not what they wanted to happen. James Lawson tells them all there will be no more marching, and turns around and goes back to the church. So they're all very upset that that's how it ended up. But as you know, from 1965 to 1968, the civil rights movement had changed. And so there was a lot of violence. As the city's burning, et cetera, et cetera. But Martin Luther King and James Lawson still believed in nonviolence. And were not popular, not with the whites or with the blacks for this. March 31, so Martin Luther King promises to come back and they'll march again. March 31, this happened. I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
It's 11 o'clock.
Thank you. I need to shut that off anyway. I'll learn one of the So I've got 10 minutes. All right, so he comes back and as he gets ready to board the plane to fly into Memphis from Atlanta, it's delayed because there's been a bomb scare. And so they take out all the luggage, they go through the plane. The plane has been guarded all night, actually, but now it's the luggage that's gone onto the plane. And so they take out all the luggage and go through all the luggage. And he finally gets up in the air and off to Memphis. The planned march was on Monday, April 8th, but in the meantime there's an injunction forbidding the march. So they have a motion on the 4th of April. They have a hearing on a motion to set aside the injunction. So we have this bomb scare. He was going to be speaking in this church, but he tells Abernathy, why don't you go? I'm tired, you go and give the talk. And Abernathy goes, and there's just a huge letdown that Martin Luther King is not going to talk to them. And Abernathy calls him and says, you can't do this. He said, these people, have gone through hell for the last 2 months. These sanitation workers, they're all here. They're all counting on you, and they need you. And Martin Luther King says, there are tornadoes outside. There's awful weather going through here. And he said, did anybody show up? And Abernathy says, oh, it's packed. Well, it wasn't packed, but he figures he had to tell Martin Luther King it was, or he might not come. So he gets there, 9:30 at night. He gets up and gives his speech. So he's our guest speaker. So he gives the speech. He goes out, he stays out almost overnight, and gets up at, I guess he goes to bed at 7 in the morning, and he's supposed to be a witness at this hearing, but he gets, I think it was Andy Young to be the witness at the hearing on that day. And of course that night, getting ready to go out to dinner, he's shot to death. So this idea of him, that he wanted to be the one who chose his Golgotha, he did, at the request of James Lawson. He knew there'd been a lot of threats on his life in Memphis, and as we will hear from him, as if he knew that he was going to die.
68, right?
68, yeah. 39 years old. So I want to tell you what's in this speech. So I had not listened to this speech when I did my first class. I'm getting ready to prepare my last class. And Selma was the title of the class, right? And then I listened to this speech and I thought, my God, he's summarized my class. And so the first thing he does, the last 15 minutes, he talks about the Good Samaritan, as we did, right? Elizabeth Eckford. And Luke, and the Levite, and the priest going by, not helping the man who's been robbed and beaten. And Grace Lorch, who came to Elizabeth Eckford's assistance and waited with her until the bus arrived. And as somebody sent me an article, also there were newspaper reporters or reporters that also stayed with her to protect her. Then he'll talk about his assassination attempt. And what would have happened if he had sneezed. Remember that?
Yes.
He would have died, he was told, that if he had sneezed. And he talks about the sit-ins. He talks about the Freedom Riders going to prison. He talked about Albany. Now, we didn't talk about Albany, Georgia, mainly because we talked about other things. You can't do everything, unfortunately. It was probably seen as King's and Southern Christian Leadership Conference's greatest failure, because instead they had a police chief who was not a Bull Connor, who was not a Jim Clark. This guy was polite. He called them sir, and he just arrested every single one of them in a very polite way. There was no beating. He'd gotten, his name was Pritchett, as you can see. He'd gotten all the counties all over the state to agree to take overflow. So his jail was never full, because he was just busing them. So they could bring them by the hundreds and the thousands, and he'd send them away. And so they didn't get very far. He talked about these children, Birmingham. He talked about the Freedom Summer, again, another one we didn't talk about. Fannie Lou Hamer going to testify and to be seated at the Democratic Convention, Mississippi Freedom Democratic Delegation. They did what they were told to do and then wouldn't be seated. They were not seated. And of course, he would talk about Selma. The last part of the speech comes from Deuteronomy, chapter 34, verses 1 through 4. Moses going to the mountaintop with God, and God showing him the promised land. But because Moses had ticked off God in some way that I don't know, I heard that I tried to find out. It said he didn't obey God's orders exactly. He sometimes talked back, and so whatever. So he gets to see the promised land, but he's not going to get there. So if anybody has difficulty hearing, I've plugged in this speaker, and if you can't hear, please bring your chair up.
But either we go up together or we go down together.
Can you hear that?
Let us develop a kind of dangerous unselfishness. One day a man came to Jesus. He wanted to raise some questions about some vital matters of life. At points he wanted to trick Jesus and show him that he knew a little more than Jesus knew and throw him off base. Now that question could have easily ended up in a philosophical and theological debate. But Jesus immediately pulled that question from midair and placed it on a dangerous curve between Jerusalem and Jericho. He talked about a certain man who fell among thieves. You remember that a Levite, and the priest passed by on the other side. They didn't stop to help him. Finally, a man of another race came by. He got down from his beast, decided not to be compassionate by proxy, but he got down with him, administered first aid, and helped the man in need. Jesus ended up saying this was the good man, this was the great man, because he had the capacity to project the eye into the thou and to be concerned about his brother. Now, you know, we use our imagination a great deal to try to determine why the priest and the Levite didn't stop. The times we say they were busy going to a church meeting, an ecclesiastical gathering, and they had to get on down to Jerusalem so they wouldn't be late for their meeting. At other times, we would speculate that there was a religious law that one who was engaged in religious ceremonial was not to...
I don't have a lot of time to tell you. If you switch to Liberty Mutual, you could save $782. Yeah!
touch a human body 24 hours before the ceremony. And every now and then we begin to wonder whether maybe they were not going down to Jerusalem, down to Jericho rather, to organize a Jericho Road Improvement Association. That's a possibility. Maybe they felt that it was better to deal with the problem from the causal root rather than to get bogged down with an individual effect. But I'm going to tell you what my imagination tells me. It's possible that those men were afraid. You see, the Jericho Road is a dangerous road. I remember when Mrs. King and I were first in Jerusalem. We rented a car and drove from Jerusalem down to Jericho. And as soon as we got on that road, I said to my wife, I can see why Jesus used this as the setting for his parable. It's a winding, meandering road. It's really conducive for ambushing. You start out in Jerusalem, which is about 1,200 miles, or rather 1,200 feet above sea level. And by the time you get down to Jericho, 15 or 20 minutes later, you're about 2,200 feet below sea level. That's a dangerous road. In the days of Jesus, it came to be known as the bloody paths. You know, it's possible that the priest and the Levite looked over that man on the ground and wondered if the robbers were still around. Or it's possible that they felt that the man on the ground was merely faking. And he was acting like he had been robbed and hurt in order to seize them over there, lure them there for quick and easy seizure. And so the first question that the priest asked, the first question that the Levite asked was, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? But then the Good Samaritan came by, and he reversed the question. If I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him? That's the question before you tonight. Not if I stop to help the sanitation worker.